I see the number of participants entering. So good morning, good afternoon, and potentially good evening, everyone. We're letting folks in as we wait for the workshop to start. So I'm really excited to spend the next 90 minutes with all of you. And I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Chunqing Lin. And as we have folks join, I'll make a brief introduction and then we can get started. And then I think, Elena, you can let me know when it's a good time for us to get started.
Thanks, Jay. I think we can actually go ahead and get started now. We'll have a few more folks filing in, but we have a good group on the line already.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Well, thank you all very much for joining us today. And I'm really excited to spend the next 90 minutes with all of you. Just a brief introduction. My name is Jay Lee. I'm a professor in residence in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at David Geffen School of Medicine. I'm a member of the UCLA Rapid Rigorous Relevant Implementation Science Hub, and I also represent the methods core for CHIPS. And real pleasure to be here. And I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Chunqing Lin, and I'll give her a moment to say a few words about herself.
Hi, morning, everyone. My name is Chunqing Lin. I'm assistant professor in resident at UCLA Department of Psychiatry, and then just as Lee, Dr. Lee, I'm also CHIPS methods core scientist and also the UCLA 3R implementation science hub co-investigator. So yeah, today we're gonna share some experiences conducting conjoint analysis in implementation science. Yeah, so we'll follow by, we have some poll question just to.
Yeah, so maybe before the poll, I wanted to just say a few words about what we expect out of this workshop. So first off, it's a real pleasure to, team up with Chunqing. I've known Chunqing for, I don't know, almost 20 years now. So it's a real pleasure to spend time with her, and I'm sure this is going to be fun. So, our objective today is really just to provide a very general introduction and overview of this method called conjoint analysis and how this can be applied in our implementation science research. And what we want to do is provide some really concrete steps in terms of what we need to do when we are trying to implement conjoint analysis methodology. And we also want to share some concrete case studies that we used to apply conjoint analysis, and hopefully have some time to think about some of the advantages as well as some of the challenges around using this method. And towards the end, we want to kind of look ahead and see how this method can be applied in future research around HIV prevention, HIV treatment, as well as addressing other comorbid conditions such as substance abuse. I think at this point, as Chunqing suggested, we wanted to get started with some poll questions. All right, so this is a very general one. How familiar are you with implementation science? Okay, so we have, all right, so we have all 81 folks answered, and let's see. So we have a pretty good mix of somewhat familiar and very familiar. So I think this is really informative in terms of, and then we have, some experts in our participant pool. So a really excited to have a pretty good range of people with familiarity with implementation science.
Yeah, and also three member never heard of it, so probably new member that have never attended previous 3R Hub workshops. So welcome new members.
Yes, welcome. And then we have, let me see. So Elena, do I need to do anything here? Okay. I'm going to close this. And then the second poll is specific to this workshop. How familiar are you with conjoint analysis? Okay, so this is a really good balance. So we have quite a number of us who's never heard of it. So hopefully this workshop will be somewhat, informative. And I think the intent of our workshop is to just provide this as a general introduction and how we can apply this in implementation science. And then for those of us who say somewhat familiar, feel free to chime in and share your thoughts about applying this method. And also folks who are very familiar, I would rely on you to share some insight in terms of how we can use this method in implementation science. And we don't have any experts, so I guess that's a good and bad, but.
Yeah, panelists cannot vote. If I could, I would vote someone familiar for myself.
I would be in the same position. I would say that I'm somewhat familiar with this method. So, well, thank you and this is really helpful in terms of how we frame our workshop today.
And there is a third poll question.
Okay, so this is a variation. Go ahead, Chunqing.
How familiar are you with other choice-based modeling approaches? Say, for example, discrete choice-based modeling, max difference, that kind of thing. Have you ever heard of those terms or familiar? Okay, pretty similar to the previous conjoint questions, right?
Pretty similar. And I think it's really great that a number of us. So hopefully this will be useful for those of us who this method is new. But for those of us who are somewhat familiar, I hope this is not going to be too introductory. And I hope that you can also have meaningful conversation and discussion around this topic as it pertains to applying in the implementation science framework. All right.
Yeah, so feel free to share your question, thoughts in the chat. Yeah, I see some folks already doing so.
Okay, great. Okay, so we can proceed to our next slide. All right. So I don't know if folks are familiar. So this is one of the movies that I watched when I was really young. So this is a movie called The Field of Dreams, this image. And it was a movie that came out in 1989. And, at the end of the movie, there's a really, striking image of all these cars approaching this baseball field, that was built by the main character, played by Kevin Costner, in the middle of a cornfield. And I think this image kind of transformed our idea in terms of thinking about what it means to build something new. And this mantra, this cultural mantra this term became very familiar and common with all of us. And I would say this term is still somewhat familiar and applicable today. So this idea is, if you build it, they will come. And I think if we think about, applying service or product to our consumers, what I want to do is I want us to challenge this cultural mantra. If they build it, if you build it, they will come. So I would say, if you click one more, the question is, but will they? And I ask this question because I think oftentimes this is never true. And I think just because we build something doesn't necessarily guarantee that whatever we build will be widely accepted or embraced by our clients, our patients, our consumers, our customers. And I think the work that we have to do has to happen before the product is developed. So through the whole process of product development, we need to really engage with our consumers in a very meaningful way. And also after the product is developed, as we think about rolling it out, we really need to listen to our consumers in terms of, what their thoughts are about this actual product being implemented in the real world setting. So I think as we challenge this notion of if you build it, they will come, I think the concept of applying conjoint analysis becomes very relevant. All right. Okay, I just want to, I'm monitoring the chat. Okay, shout out from Iowa. Okay, great. All right, so we're going to be talking about conjoint analysis, and I think the very broad definition of conjoint analysis, it's not a definition, but it's a description of what this method is. And I would say this is a very well-established market research technique, and it's been used in many different settings, specifically in marketing and economics, and somewhat more in psychology field as well. And I think it's a method that we can use to predict consumer preferences when faced with a number of characteristics or attributes that make up a product or service. So as we think about, most of us are doing public health research, whether it's around, HIV prevention or HIV treatment, addressing a lot of structural barriers and also other comorbid conditions. So as we think about implementing a service or, an intervention, this method can be very relevant in terms of thinking about specific components or attributes that make up our service. And this method allows us to really quantify which specific attributes will influence our consumers' decision around accepting the product or service. And I think that's why this method has been becoming much more popular. And the reference from Rao and the article by Rao, there was a statement saying this was the most significant development in marketing research methodology over the last 40 years. So I think the conjoint analysis, it really allows us to really mimic the actual trade-offs that people have to make when they have to make a decision in a real life scenario. All right. Okay, next. Okay, so this is a really simple example of how conjoint analysis can be useful. So, the current climate, I would say this is a relevant example because I don't know what the latest gas prices are in Los Angeles, but I think it's like creeping up to like almost $5 a gallon, right? So gas prices are really expensive, and suppose you're in the market for getting a new car, and specifically you're in the market for getting a new electric vehicle. And when you think about buying an electric vehicle, you can really think about many different features that make up a car. So it could be about the engine size, the wheel size, the interior, the leather color and the material, the stereo system, different options you can have like cup holders, the cargo space. So as you can see, when you think about even a relatively simple example of buying a car, there's so many different features that you have to consider. So for simplicity's sake, let's just focus on 4 different specific features that make up an electric vehicle. So the we have two brand models. So we have Nissan Leaf and we have Tesla Model 3. And when we consider four different characteristics, so engine power, interior cargo space, and then how many miles you can go per full charge, and then the price of the vehicle. So, in a traditional setting, if you ask potential buyers one characteristic at a time, which one would you prefer, a car with a bigger engine, more powerful engine, or less powerful engine? I would say most of us would say, yeah, I want a car with a pretty good engine power. And then if you ask somebody, how about cargo space? Do you want an interior cargo space that's pretty spacious, or do you want a cargo space that's not as spacious? And I think naturally most people would prefer a car with an interior cargo space that's more spacious. And similarly with mileage per charge and price. So if you ask this characteristics one at a time, it's informative, but not as informative as the ability for consumers to make real life trade-offs between these characteristics. So if we ask, somebody, would you prefer a car that has 271 horsepower that costs 55,000 versus a car that has 147 horsepower but costs 29,000? Then people have to make a decision and make trade-offs between what feature is really important for them. So some might say that, yeah, I would prefer a car that's really, economical, and even though it's less powerful, I'd rather, buy a car that's like close to 30,000 rather than 55,000. So it kind of, the decision making power, it kind of mimics the real life scenario, and people have to make choices in terms of balancing across these specific attributes. So I want this to be informal. I think we had one hand up, and I wanted to, how do we do this? Do we answer a question as we go along? What do you think, Chunqing?
I don't see. Oh.
Okay. So hi, Luz. Good to see you. Sorry, that was a mistake. Okay. Thanks for confirming. I just want to make sure that we, we address questions, and I would like this to be sort of informal as well. So, okay. All right. So let's proceed.
Okay, so let's look at another example of hair dryer. Say, for example, you are shopping for hair dryer and did some research and narrowed down to three popular model that is in the market. So you probably recognize this is a Dyson, this is Panasonic, this is T3, and they all come with like a different level. We have like a different factors, features to consider, whether it's powerful, how heavy it is, if it make really loud noise, and how many levels of heat settings, and if that comes with still voltage, and of course its price, right? And say for example, Dyson is the most powerful one, but it's more expensive, and T3 is less powerful, but come with dual voltage and also affordable price. So I think different people will make different choices, but it's all like a trade-off choices, as Dr. Lee mentioned. So say for example, if you are very rich, money is not an issue for you, then of course you go for the best one, Dyson. And if you are a frequent international traveler, and dual voltage is the uttermost concern for you, then of course you go for T3, right? So if you are somewhere in the middle, or you have really a lot of hair and then want a relatively powerful hair dryer, but you have a very tight budget, then you probably want to choose Panasonic one, right? So yeah, it's same idea. Like people have to make trade-off choices, yeah, based on your need, your budget. So that's the basic idea underlying conjoint analysis. So there's a question in the chat. Factors also taking. Yeah, so thank you for your question about the importance of factors and variation in prioritization. So that's exactly we were going to cover in the next slides. So next. So taking this conjoint analysis into implementation science research, we have some like analogy, taking evidence-based intervention as a product, right? So using the simple language introduced by Dr. Karan here. He's a renowned implementation scientist and also a consultant of our 3R Hub. So he used the simple language, the thing, to refer to evidence-based intervention. So here is the product. So the potential patient or stakeholder, we want those evidence-based intervention to be adopted. We consider them as our customer, right? So so we use conjoint analysis to model how they make choices and how they put different value in different feature of the product. So that's the application of conjoint analysis in implementation science research. So can you go to the next? Okay, so so conjoint analysis we can break down into very broad steps, 4 steps. First is to develop attributes. So attribute, you probably already figured out by now, it's a feature of the evidence-based model. So just like the car example, how powerful it is, how expensive it is, the cargo space, these are all attributes, right? So how do we develop attribute? We have to do some like a formative study and also literature review, just to figure out what kind of factors that are most influential in people's decision making, right? So, and also those attributes, they will come with a varying level of choices, right? Price can be like using the car example, all cars come with varying level of cost, varying level of cargo space. So attribute come with varying level of levels, right? So using like the second step is using different attributes and levels to generate some scenario, which is to form a hypothetical or real life product that can be later presented to our target customer, right? So the third is a master scenario, which is basically you present your products, different level of different type of product to your customer, who can be like a patient or hospital stakeholder, just to, and then have them rate each of the scenario in terms of how likely they're gonna adopt or purchase this product. And then the fourth step is to analyze their how do I say, willingness to adopt as the acceptability rating, and then to figure out what kind of attribute plays the most important role in their decision making. So I think
Yeah, so I think in terms of these general 4 steps that are included in applying this method, I would say that developing attributes is probably the most critical and important step, and we can go through the process in which we took, like the formative research that we did for a specific case study. But I would say that product attributes are very important, and it's important to engage the specific tailored target community that you want to engage with. So, a segment of potential consumers, they're very different. So we need to figure out who our intended audiences and really get their meaningful input in terms of what attributes and the level of attributes would make the most sense. And I think there's a question from Anne: how does this reconcile with predictable but irrational behavior? In other words, I imagine people say they value a certain attribute, but then act in a way that suggests to value a different attribute. Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think, in terms of, so there's 2 areas. So we can use this method to really think about implementing an intervention that's already available, like evidence-based intervention, but we can also use this for kind of engaging with consumers for a hypothetical product that's currently not available. And I think past literature does suggest that someone's intention or their perception of whether they'll be their acceptability intention may not directly predict their action when the product becomes available. So that's an inherent limitation that we have. So, but I think the case study that we're going to show is that one of the attributes. So we're going to be talking about. So jumping ahead a little bit, we're going to be talking about this application of conjoint analysis and looking at HIV vaccine acceptability. One of the attributes that we're going to be considering is efficacy. But the efficacy choices that we have is, one level of efficacy is like probably not really realistic in terms of thinking about the actual vaccine that's going to be developed. But if the customers and consumers really want a vaccine that's 99% efficacious, we need to really think about how to align expectations before the product becomes available in the real world setting, so that when the product is available and the efficacy is less than 99%, we have an option and opportunity to really realign consumers' expectation. So.
And then there's one more question about the difference between conjoint analysis and discrete choice experiment, and that's exactly what we are going to cover in later slides.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
So Dr. Lee, you will be talking about the first case study about HIV vaccine. Already said it.
Yeah, and then Claire had a point about attributes you display next to each other and how you display the value of the attributes could bias. Yes, and also the order in which the hypothetical scenario is presented could also influence the way that people will answer in terms of sharing their acceptability. So these are really all great questions. And I'm really glad that we have people who are very familiar with conjoint analysis. So I welcome, sharing ideas and your thoughts throughout the workshop. So as I mentioned before, so what I want to do at this point is kind of share the work that we did around HIV vaccine acceptability. So the research question that we have, and this was done, a lot of this work was done in early to mid 2000s. So, obviously at that time, we were really hopeful that we'll have a HIV vaccine in the near future. And we're in year 2022, and we're still not near in terms of coming up with a vaccine. So I would say the work that we did in, mid 2000 is still quite relevant. So the research question that we had was, how would different attributes that make up a hypothetical FDA-approved vaccine impact vaccine acceptability among consumers, among potential consumers. Okay, so next slide. So as Chunqing highlighted, the 4 basic steps that make up the conjoint analysis, this general conjoint analysis method, I would say for the first step, in terms of developing attributes, for the initial pilot study that we did with high-risk communities in Los Angeles County, what we did was we had a series of events. We had a series of work groups with experts, community advisory groups that serve a lot of marginalized communities that are impacted by HIV. We also, engage with a lot of potential consumers who make up a very diverse background. And we conducted a series of focus groups. We also did like key informant interviews and in-depth interviews. And out of all these formative work, we came up with, specific attributes, and we assigned levels for each attribute. And I would say this is probably the most important step in terms of applying conjoint analysis. And in thinking about the work that you're doing, I would say spend some time and really find ways to really engage with relevant parties that should be involved in terms of coming up with attributes. And the other caveat is, I think different communities have different preferences around what attributes are really important to them. And those reflections and preferences has to be taken into account when we think about developing specific attributes for in this case, it's a hypothetical FDA-approved HIV vaccine. Okay. All right, so based on the work that we did for the HIV vaccine conjoint analysis, we came up with 7 attributes, and these are efficacy, cross-clade protection, side effects, and how long the vaccine will protect them, the duration of protection, the route of administration, whether it's oral or by injection, the number of doses, and cost. And another disclosure is these 7 attributes the levels were dichotomized. So the example that's going to follow, for example, efficacy, we varied between, I believe it's like 50% to 95% in one study. And then I think we varied it across 50% to 99% in another study with another community. So we can proceed. I just want to make sure that, okay, so let me see. So the chat says, thanks for your responses. I imagine there is a behavior effect just by asking people to consider different attributes. Yeah, I think that's really true. And this is something that we have to consider in terms of implementing conjoint analysis, administering conjoint analysis. And I would love to talk more about some of the challenges around this. Okay, yes. Yes, how you frame the choice exercise is also very important. So for this specific example, so we had 2 levels, dichotomous, 7 attributes, they're all dichotomous. So we have possibility of 2 to the 7th power. So we had 128 possible scenarios that we can come up with when we think about different types of hypothetical vaccines that we can consider. So obviously, I think as we engage with our potential users, presenting them with 128 possible scenarios of a hypothetical vaccine would become really unwieldy, and the exercise wouldn't be as productive and informative. So what we did was we used a fractional factorial orthogonal design to come up with 8 specific scenarios that make up the 8 specific scenarios across consisting of 7 attributes that make up the vaccine. And the assumption that we have to make is that we are estimating the main effects only. So the main effect of the effect of all these specific attributes, whether it's efficacy, side effects, cost, a route of administration, duration of protection, and cross-clade protection. Okay, so let's go on. So in terms of practical, practicality, there's a really useful SAS, ADS interface to use to really generate the scenario. So for this example, you can use this syntax to come up with the different scenarios of hypothetical HIV vaccine. So the variable names consist of the 7 dichotomous attributes. And the first line is basically telling SAS that, we are varying across, for each attribute, we're varying, across 2 levels. And then we want 8 hypothetical scenarios. And when you do this, it'll basically spit out the number of possible scenarios varying across 7 attributes with 2 levels for each attribute. And then there's a reference on the bottom. Okay. So this is the output of, so once we use the SAS ADX, we'll come up with, generate the hypothetical scenarios, and the attributes that we came up with based on the key informant interviews and focus groups and in-depth interviews, consultation with experts. So the 7 attributes are efficacy, cross-clade protection, side effects, duration of protection, route of administration, number of doses, and cost. The yellow ones are the attributes that are preferred, and the blue ones are attributes that are levels of attributes that are hypothetically not preferred. So for efficacy, we varied across 50% to 95%. And then the cross-clade protection basically says this vaccine will protect you from one type of virus versus multiple types. Side effects, we varied, no side effects to minor. And then the duration of protection is lifetime versus 10 years. And then the route of administration is either it's injected or taken orally. Number of doses is 1 to 3. And then the cost will vary between $10 and $50. Okay, let's go ahead. So once we come up with the hypothetical bundle scenario, so we have 8 scenarios, and then we have to engage with our potential users to administer this hypothetical vaccines. So we've done it in multiple ways. So one way we can do it is basically doing a face-to-face interview. So we present them with 8 laminated cards. So each one, representing a hypothetical HIV vaccine. And then we shuffle them. And then we give it to our potential candidate. And then we ask the participants to rate them in terms of acceptability. And it was a 5-point Likert scale, highly likely to highly unlikely. And then I think neutral or unsure being in the middle. And then we ask them to rate them. And the way the exercise happens is that once you give it to them, they can look at each scenario and then rate how likely he or she or they will be willing to accept this vaccine. And then they go through the exercise, and it gives them an opportunity to change their mind. So once they go through all 8 scenarios, sometimes people would, change their preference based on the remaining cards that they see. And then we've also had cases where participants, regardless of the variations across the eight vaccines, they just said highly unlikely to all of them. We also had cases where the participant was really eager and optimistic about getting the vaccine. And they said, oh, it doesn't really matter. As long as the vaccine is available, I'm really willing to try it. And then they would say highly likely to all of them. A lot of them kind of fell in between where, it did their responses did vary based on the specific attributes and the levels of each attribute. And then we also had an opportunity to kind of administer this in a focus group setting. So what we did, and this was done among the Thai residents that lived in Los Angeles. And what we did was we conducted a focus group to really think about some of the challenges and barriers around, vaccines in general, thinking about hypothetical vaccines in general. And then after the focus group, we gave them this conjoint analysis exercise, and they were seated in a group setting, but then, we had facilitators that were floating across tables, and, they were doing it in a group setting, but kind of in an individual setting. And facilitators were able to provide support if they had any questions about the exercise. Okay. And if you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to use the chat function. So in terms of the analysis, because this was done for the specific case study considering hypothetical HIV vaccine, we had 7 dichotomous attributes. So, the acceptability of a hypothetical vaccine is basically the 7 dichotomous attributes act as independent variables in the model. It's a dichotomous variable, preferred or not preferred. And the mathematical representation is this formula. It's a bunch of Greek symbols. And it's basically a summation over the 7 regression coefficients that represent each of the 7 attributes that make up the vaccine. So the regression coefficient for each vaccine attribute, for example, the efficacy, side effects, cost in the model is what we call the impact score of the attribute on vaccine acceptability for the individual respondent. Okay. And then I'll give an example of what we mean by the mathematical representation of the impact score. So because we had 8 different vaccines and 7 different dichotomous attributes, the mathematical representation of the impact score of each attribute was basically looking at the net difference in overall mean acceptability between the 4 scenarios with the preferred value of each attribute, and then getting the difference by averaging the 4 vaccines with attributes with a non-preferred value. And as we go forward, it'll make more sense if we look at the examples. Okay, so this was the first pilot study that we did with Los Angeles communities. And so the good thing is across the 8 different vaccines, the acceptability score had a pretty wide range. So the acceptability score ranged from 33 all the way to 82.2. And then, it goes to show that the specific attributes that make up the vaccine had a significant impact on people's decision to accept the vaccine. And the mean impact score that was really significant were efficacy with the impact score of 22.68, cross-clade protection, side effects, followed by duration of protection. And based on this pilot study, we found out that the route of administration and the number of doses and the cost didn't really have an impact on their decision-making. The cost was interesting. We thought that the cost would be really important. It wasn't. And I think the reason was, when we came up with the cost value, I think we didn't really vary it too much. So I think $10 versus $50. So had it been a different value for the cost, for example, we could do like free versus like $200. I think that would have been more, that would have influenced people's decision-making process more so than varying between like $10 and $50. So when I said the impact score is a mathematical representation of the net difference between the preferred and the non-preferred value. So for example, if you look at efficacy here, so the efficacy with the 95% efficacy, which is the preferred value, if you sum up the vaccine number 2, 6, 8, and 4, so 82.2, 73.3, 73.1, 56.6. You get the average of that, and then you get the vaccine numbers 1, 7, 5, and 3, and then get the average of that. And if you take a net difference, you would get an impact score of 22.68. So it's identical to the mathematical representation of the formula that we showed. Okay, and then I have a question here. Okay, so Gabriel said, would be interesting to consider how the preferences change for infections that don't always become chronic. Yes, yeah, I think that's a really good question. And then Courtney asked, can the regression accommodate interaction terms? So the answer is yes. And I think the assumption that we're making for this particular exercise is that we're only estimating the main effect, and we're only doing that because the 8 scenarios that we chose out of the 128 possible scenarios, the assumption that we're making is we can only make inferences on the fixed effects, the main effects of each attribute. But you're right, I think there's potential interaction across different attributes. For example, there might be an interaction between efficacy and side effects. So, a vaccine that is highly efficacious might come with a little more moderate side effects versus a vaccine that is, less efficacious but no side effects, for example. And I think, and it could be vice versa. So interaction terms are important, but I think in terms of figuring out how to engage with potential consumers so that the choices that we're presenting to them doesn't become too unwieldy, I think we have to figure out how to strike a fine balance. And I think if we kind of move forward and thinking about future applications, I think there's an opportunity to consider interaction terms in the future and later on, so we can talk about that. Okay. Okay. All right, so how are we doing on time? Okay, so I think we're doing okay. So just real quick, so, based on that example, so the, multi-ethnic LA sample that we presented, we also we applied this to different communities as pilot studies. So the Los Angeles Thai community sample, as well as with my collaborator who used to be at UCLA, he's currently at the University of Toronto. We were able to engage with Aboriginal Canadian population to do this. And in terms of the attributes, it is important to think about how some attributes are more important in certain communities than others. So for the LA samples, the 7 attributes were equally, I mean, they were important, but for the Aboriginal Canadian sample, another attribute that they were really interested in was the vaccine-induced seropositivity. They were concerned, like, if I get the vaccine, would I test HIV positive? And that's something that they really wanted to consider. So we dropped the route, and the route of administration they didn't really care about. So we varied the attributes based on the specific preferences of our target community. Okay, we can proceed. So, those were 3 pilot studies that we did, and we actually conducted a full widely scale conjoint analysis research study, and this was funded by NIMH, and this was led by one of my mentors, Dr. Billy Cunningham, and I would like to acknowledge his contribution and his leadership to this work. And unfortunately, he left us a couple of years back, but I really want to acknowledge his work in this. And this was obviously, same methodology, and we've done this in a much larger scale. And looking at the different types of attributes, we were able to, implement this in a large scale with various groups in Los Angeles with a sample size of over 1,000. And the the findings kind of mirror the pilot studies. The efficacy was really important, as well as the side effects. So if you go to the next slide. So the way we presented this impact score was basically looking at the net difference between the preferred attribute and the non-preferred attribute. So if you look at the efficacy, 99% versus 50%, we see for the preferred attribute, the overall score was 69.5, and then the net overall for the non-preferred attribute was 39.6 with a net difference of 29.9. So that's the impact factor of efficacy on vaccine acceptability for this particular sample. Okay. All right, so this case study that we presented, looking at 3 pilot studies and the full scale research study looking at vaccine acceptability. In terms of applying this, we were able to do it in individual setting, as well as in a group setting with the Thai LA resident sample. And I would say that, this method really provided insight into, HIV vaccine acceptability across many different communities that are highly impacted by HIV. We did see a quite range of acceptability score across the 8 vaccines. And across all samples, I think efficacy had the greatest impact. And then some of the attributes, we had some variations. And again, when I said this, this work was done in like early to mid 2000s. And there was an RFA that just came out recently, and this is an RFA from NIMH and NIDA, and it's looking at advancing communication strategies to support future HIV vaccine use. So I would say that given that we've done this work many years ago, it's still very relevant, and I would encourage folks to look at this RFA for consideration. Okay, so I'm gonna be quiet now and turn it over to Dr. Chunqing Lin to share the second case study.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lee. So the second study, the study question is that we all know, like every year, like billions of research dollars are invested to develop behavioral intervention models, right? So some models, their test to be efficacious in trial settings, but eventually how are they going to be adopted in real life hospital setting is questionable. That's the whole rationale behind implementation science, right? So same idea, we use conjoint analysis to answer the research question, what kind of factors do hospital take into account in their decision making to adopt a certain evidence-based intervention in their hospital setting. Yeah. Okay, we'll go to next. Yes. So we are gonna use real life evidence-based intervention as an example to study this issue. So the intervention is called white coat or warm heart intervention, developed by my mentor, Dr. Levy. I believe she's in the audience. So this behavioral intervention model is developed to reduce service providers' stigma towards people living with HIV. So the intervention has the basic component is to identify and train some popular opinion leader from providers in the hospital to disseminate stigma reduction messages to their peer providers, and also promote standard precaution to reduce their fear-based stigma. So if you have interest in this intervention, I leave the reference down below. So basically, this intervention was tested in 40 county hospital with 1,760 provider in China, and then it's a randomized trial cluster randomized cluster randomized trial design, it was this intervention model show significant stigma reduction among intervention hospital providers. We were able to report positive outcome at 6 and 12 months. So using this example, we test how likely hospital directors are willing to adopt this model in their hospital. So can you go to next? So just want to point out that this the difference between this study and the study one that Jay has presented is like this model is a real life behavioral intervention model rather than HIV vaccine that's hypothetical, right? But the steps of conjoint analysis is very much similar. So the first is to develop attribute. So we conducted literature review to identify factors that there are associated with adoption, routinization, and we pay special attention to what happened in healthcare settings, and then around the topic of stigma reduction, provider training, and infection control and standard precaution, right? And also, we conducted in-depth interview with 30 healthcare administrators to ask them what are the factors they mainly consider when they are considering if to adopt a certain model into their routine provider training. So can you go to next? Yeah, so based on these literature review and in-depth interview, we narrowed down to 7 attributes, which are administrative support, cost, personnel involvement, like what percentage of hospital or provider needs to be involved, and format, which is flexible format like online training, and inflexible format as in person, right? And also duration of training, if technical support is available, and also if reducing stigma is a priority in their setting. Yeah, can you go to next? Yeah, so same thing. So the next step is to generate scenario. So to avoid just to be simple, we have 2 level for each attribute, a desired level and an undesired level. Say for example, the format is flexible is desired, and if the majority provider has to be involved, then that's undesired. And training long versus long, short versus long, right? Same thing, because Dr. Lee already introduced, so I wouldn't repeat. So we use the SAS macro to develop A scenarios, which is presented in the next slide. Yeah, so same thing. We use the we highlight the preferred feature in yellow and non-preferred feature in blue. Say right, so we have maximum administrative support and minimum cost. It's relatively cheap and expensive. Right, so I have to point out here. So after we come up with this scenario, we did some pilot testing with those who provider who participate in the in-depth interview, right? So just to make sure that these scenarios are actually realistic and relevant, understandable, right? So for the cost, we originally have 2 level, which is $500 versus $200. But during during the pilot testing, some hospital director point out that different level of hospital could interpret this cost differently, right? So for provincial hospital, they could think $500 is pretty cheap, but for county level hospital could think 200 is pretty expensive. That's why we just leave like a more generic terms as cheap, relatively cheap versus relatively expensive. So it's just yeah, some design consideration. And also yeah, yeah. So next slide, please. So then we conduct, so the step 3 as the same thing as study 1 is to a mixture scenario with hospital stakeholder, right? So then we recruit hospital director with different individual and hospital background, and about 1/3 from provincial hospital, 1/3 from city, 1/3 from county level, and about 1/3 from specialty hospitals, and 10 they had like a participate in the original W intervention, right? So we want to include participants from different backgrounds just to get that's so-called like a customer segmentation. Just see if there are any differentiated preference among different groups. Yeah, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, so to a measure scenario, so we did a face-to-face intervention with the hospital director. So we had to give interviewer some special training to introduce the WW intervention. So the as Dr. Lee already pointed out in the previous slide, that there are different methods of the Mr. Conjoint analysis, right? Some can be in person, some can be like a mail-in, some can be online. So the reason we select in face-to-face here is that the WW intervention is pretty complex model to comprehend than a simple product like hair dryer, right? So we have to train interviewer to introduce this model in a systematic way, and not only the model but the attributes and the levels in a systematic way. And also because hospital directors, they are pretty busy, so we want to have some like a human interaction to make sure that they are really engaged in this conjoint administrator. So this can be very different from just some consider, I wouldn't say like computer-based is not good, it's just for this specific case. There are some like a rationale behind this administration methods. So same thing, we have answer cards representing different scenarios. For each scenario, the hospital directors will give 5 categories of acceptability rating from highly unlikely to highly likely. And also at the same time, they fill out a survey to document their personal demographics, professional background, and hospital background. Yeah. So do you need to take in some question with the using?
Yeah, I think you can. Yeah, you can proceed, Chunqing. I think
Okay.
our folks who are familiar with conjoint analysis are chiming in, so this is great.
I see. Okay, so in the interest of time, I will just quickly go over this case. So this is shows the acceptability rating of the scenario. So as you can see, the first scenario received the highest rating, which is 4 out of 5, and then the number 7 received the lowest, right? So there's one mistake I made at the time of the study, which I would like to point out here so that you can avoid in the future, right? So when we actually did the conjoint analysis, some of the hospital director, they point out that actually the scenario number 8 is not really realistic, right? So because say for example, number 8, it involves 50% of the provider has long training period. You have to do in person. Therefore, the cost wouldn't be cheap, right? So this is not really a realistic scenario, although it's generated by mathematical methods. So the lessons learned is you cannot always rely on SAS to generate some scenario for you. You always have to check like how realistic the scenario is, right? So also to going back to the interaction between attribute. So this is relevant because cost is always have some kind of association with other factors, right? So that's why you have to take into account the realism of scenario, and later maybe you can take into account using some statistical method, say for example, built into interaction terms in the analysis. So next. So same thing, when you analyze data, same idea, you use the dependent variable is the acceptability rating of a scenario, and independent variable is the attribute. So we categorize preferred level as 1, non-preferred as 0. So, and also because each hospital director, they responded 8 times, right? So the model it's a mixed effect model, including a random effect of a respondent level random effect to take into account the clustering effect of responses within a person, right? And yeah, so the regression coefficient is actually the impact score of the attribute. Yeah. Next slide. So this is the a result of the mixed effect model. As you can see, that the cost has the highest level of impact on hospital directors' decision making. The impact score being 24, right? The duration of training is the second, with impact score being 10, followed by availability of technical support format. So surprisingly, administrative support and priority in personnel involvement didn't reach statistical significant level, right? So can you go to the next slide? Yeah, so what does this example tell us is that, of course, we already know that it tells you what kind of factor has the most significant influence on hospital directors' decision making. So it also suggested that any intervention effort, even early on during the developmental stage, you have to take into account of the how much resources it has to take, because hospital stakeholders, they have like a physical responsibility of the hospital operation. So they will always look for something that's more cost effective. And also for hospital provider, they have very busy working schedule. So it's always favorable to have some training format that's flexible, and they have the control of time. And always during the intervention rollout, you should always consider providing accessible technical support so that it can be carried out the way as it's original designed, right? So that's the end of this study. So we think we should take in some questions before we move on to the summary.
Yeah, so we're doing okay on time. I think we have, so a number of us I noticed had to drop off. I'm hoping that it's not us, and I'm hoping that they had a meeting at noon. But we have 17 more minutes, so maybe we can and the audience, feel free to chime in and ask questions.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah,
so,
I definitely agree with the the comment that the attributes level. So it's suggested to be numerically defined, but yeah, as the example in study 2, that different people have different interpretation of cost, right? So it's a good practice to tailor those levels based on the subgroup of customers. Yeah.
and Logan had a really good question. Do either of the studies have additional survey items that were analyzed? Yeah, so for the vaccine acceptability study, it was embedded. It was one component of a quantitative survey that we conducted with our, at-risk folks who are at risk for HIV. And a lot of those survey questions dealt with many different factors, including like the level of mistrust with their providers, their access, the location in terms of where they get the care, belief about conspiracy theory around HIV and the AIDS, and then conjoint analysis was done as part of the survey in an individual setting. So, the questions that we ask does have an impact on how they answer the hypothetical HIV vaccine acceptability preference. And then similarly, the pilot study that we did with the Thai LA resident sample, we conducted a focus group to really learn about their experience and their perception about hypothetical HIV vaccine. So I would say that they were already kind of primed to really think about, HIV vaccine, and then we conducted the conjoint analysis afterward in a group setting. So I think the way we frame the exercise does have an impact on the responses, and I think those are some of the design considerations that we have to make.
Right, and also in terms of sample size and customer segmentation. So the study 2 only included 60 hospital director, mainly because of the availability of this population, right? So yeah, and also the cost. But I would say in general, so the rule of thumb is to include at least somewhere between 200 to 300 for conjoint analysis. So if you are considering compare subgroups, then it's suggested you have at least 200 per subgroup so that you can compare their preference with their some other factors, say for example their demographic background, their healthcare needs, and also their health beliefs. So of course those things has to be could be considered when you design the survey question. You have to say, for example, include some of the relevant background information in the question so that you can conduct analysis later on to identify some of the associations. Yeah. So should we move on to the next slide?
Yeah, and I think you answered some of Annie's question. Okay, so let's. I think there was one more question about
discrete choice.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So discrete choice. So I think basically the outcome is just two level. One is choice as yes, well, chosen as yes, and not chosen as no. So it's just like the so the modeling you have to use say for example logistic regression model rather than like a linear regression model, right?
Yeah. So the example that we gave, I think. So Elena, if you can go forward. One more, and then we can, I think we talked about this already, but I want to spend some time to think about future applications. So next. So I think a lot of these questions are really important, and I want to go back to, the notion, if they build it, they will come. And we have to challenge that notion. And when we think, and then the examples that we gave, one was, still to this day, we don't have a HIV vaccine. So it's a hypothetical scenario, and we're engaging with potential candidates for HIV vaccine. And then the intervention example in China that Chunqing presented is a real life scenario where we're implementing an evidence-based intervention. So I think in terms of thinking about the different type of conjoint analysis method that we can use. So one possibility is that, for example, the HIV vaccine study that we did, we do realize that there were some impact factors that were much more influential in terms of influencing people's decision. And what we can do is we can kind of refine it by reducing the number of attributes that are most influential, and then conduct. So it's like this idea of like adaptive, conjoint analysis. And then the discrete choice analysis, if we can narrow down the number of different types of interventions, and based on the initial exercise that we did using conjoint analysis with varying attributes, and then if we can narrow down the option of implementing version A versus version B, what we do is we ask the potential consumers to choose which version they would prefer. And then what we do is we basically count the number of, it's a count thing. So it's, version A got like, 70 votes versus version B got 13 votes. So it's a different type of, discrete choice experiment, but I think it would depend on, and including the sample size, it would depend on our objective of using this method. So for example, as we know that in terms of prevention, the long-acting cabotegravir, for injection for HIV prevention, it's not out in the market yet. So one would think that there might be many attributes that we should consider among vulnerable communities that would benefit from this. And that conjoint analysis exercise might be very different from implementing a PrEP care continuum with an FDA-approved pre-exposure prophylaxis, where the PrEP program is currently being implemented in many community settings. And then the application of this, and then Chunqing, you can kind of talk about the opioid use disorder.
Yeah, same idea for the medication treatment for opioid use disorder. So currently we have three major category of medication available: methadone, bup, and naltrexone, and they all come with different forms: liquid, tablet, injection, and film. Like a long-acting injection, just as the PrEP example, same thing. It recently come to market, become approved by FDA. And then they also have various frequency of administration for oral you use daily and for injection monthly. So also same idea, it comes trade-off decision, right? So the injection, you only have to inject once, but the availability is low. So I imagine people have to travel long hours to some specialized care setting to get it, and then also come with probably some out of pocket costs, depends on your insurance, right? And also different form come with different side effects. So we can use conjoint analysis um, to find out like which subgroup of um, patient would welcome certain type of medication, so that we can find our target user. Yeah,
Mm.
same thing.
Yeah, and then it looks like Rebecca mentioned that she's currently working on a discrete choice experiment among clients and providers about, long-acting injectable for antiretroviral therapy. So that's really exciting, and I'd love to learn more about the work that you're doing. So that's great. Um, and one other thing I wanted to mention, and then somebody mentioned about COVID vaccine and vaccination against COVID-19. So the examples, particular example that I shared, it was really focused on specific attribute of a hypothetical product, HIV vaccine in this case. But as you notice, like Chunqing's example was not really about a single product, but like a characteristics or the setting in which the intervention is being implemented. So I think the use of conjoint analysis, the attributes can be applied in many different ways. So, thinking about COVID vaccination, one thing I can think about is, how the messaging around COVID vaccination can be considered in terms of, increasing the uptake of COVID vaccine. So it doesn't necessarily have to be specific attributes pertaining to the vaccine itself, but it can be applied in terms of thinking about different scenarios or messaging or setting in which the vaccine is being provided. So I would say that application of this method can be very broad.
Yeah, and I also see a question in the chat about the number of attribute you have to consider. So I think the basic rule is not to overwhelm your respondents, right? So it's recommended to have no more than 6 to 8 attribute, but you also have to consider the respondents' cognitive level and their level of understanding. So if the concept you are introducing is really new or people lack experience, so you might want to reduce to even fewer attributes. Yeah. Yeah, so same thing for the level of number of levels, right? So we talk about categorical levels and continuous level, and you can do like 2 level, 3 level, but the goal is not to have like an overly complicated scenario. So yeah.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that we have colleagues who are very who have expertise beyond Chunqing and I. And I think the idea is this concept of conjoint analysis is just a broad for this workshop, it's a broad introduction, and I think there are many different considerations that we can take. And I think Rebecca mentioned like other, other methods like max diff and best score scaling. And I think those are all very important. And I hope that this kind of gives us an opportunity and motivation to consider this as a viable option in terms of thinking about, disseminating our work and using the implementation science framework.
Yeah, so about, should we move on to the next
Sure.
slide? Yeah, so I think we have already covered most of these during the study. So can we move on to the next? Yeah, so choice-based conjoint analysis. So we have already covered and adapt. So yeah, there's a question about adaptive design, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
so so it's like a more of an advanced technology of doing conjoint analysis, combining with artificial intelligence. So yeah, I was fascinated to see an example in online marketing, right? So say for example, when you are using Amazon, so they actually check your the level of the time you spend on a certain product, so the computer system will quickly, so the time you stay on certain page is an indication of your level of interest, right? So and then the computer system will do analysis in real time to against the product features, so that they immediately pursue some other products with similar feature just to increase the level of the likelihood of purchasing. So this is a more like an advanced application of conjoint analysis in market research. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So I know that we are almost out of time, but I believe that the slides will be available. Elena, that's true, right? And then I think this recording will also be available for future viewing.
That's right. We'll send both out to all participants after the session.
Yeah, and also to point out some like a resource page and reference at the end.
Yeah, so these are some of the resources that we recommend, as well as the next page. This basically just highlights some of the work that we did to apply this in many different settings, including like willingness to participate in HIV trials. And, one of my mentees used this to look at dual testing for syphilis and HIV, and long-acting injectable, and then Chunqing's work on implementation of evidence-based interventions. So wide application of this method. Okay, and these are just acknowledgements, and I really appreciate your attention, and I appreciate your time, and I hope to continue our discussion going forward.
Yeah, if you have a question, don't hesitate to reach out to me. So we leave our contact information in the last slide. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you all.